Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, with a presentation looking at the Vietnam War. Specifically, I'm going to look at what was woefully wrong with America's tactics in the war. America tried to use its technological superiority to its advantage, and I will draw attention to three specific tactics, each making use of America's superior air power: conventional bombing, chemical bombing, and making use of helicopters in search and destroy missions. Let's first take a look at saturated bombing. Operation Rolling Thunder, using B-52s, was launched early in the war, in February 1965. It targeted industrial as well as military and strategic targets in North Vietnam. Factories, army bases, railways and bridges, attempting to cut the supplies to the Viet Cong. But the port of Haiphong, which received the supplies coming from the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, was not bombed for fear of hitting Soviet ships. Still, by 1966, American planes were flying on average over 150 missions a day. Then, near the war's end, from 1972, Operations Linebacker 1 and Linebacker 2 targeted towns and cities in both North and South Vietnam, with Hanoi, the North Vietnamese capital, and Haiphong hit most. From the outset, civilian casualties, collateral damage was the military term, were high. And throughout the war, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was also targeted in an effort to close down that critical supply route. And controversially, at times, this involved the bombing of Laos and Cambodia too, because that was where the trail went for large parts of it. However, bombing was not a particularly successful tactic. More bombs were dropped on Vietnam than were dropped on Germany and Japan combined in World War II. And it was very costly. It also led to the loss of 14,000 American and South Vietnamese planes. It also brought controversy and protests back home in America, as well as in Europe. What was America doing to this poor country in the name of freedom? And despite all the bombs that America dropped, the Ho Chi Minh Trail remained open throughout the war, though it could be argued that this was a result of the incredible determination of the Viet Cong as much as any failure on the part of the Americans. And it can be said that the linebacker campaigns did bring the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table. But if conventional bombing brought protests, this was nothing to the protests against the use of chemical weapons. Two types were used: napalm and Agent Orange. Napalm was brutally horrific. It burnt the jungle where guerrilla fighters might be hiding, but it also burned right through to the bone. And in jungle clearings were villages, and in those villages were men and women, old and young, as well as children. Less dramatic, but just as horrific, was Agent Orange. It was highly toxic and was sprayed on thousands of square kilometres of jungle. Over 80 million litres were used in order to destroy the foliage. But of course it got into the water systems, and so into the crops as well as drinking water, and so poisoned men and women, old and young, as well as children, even unborn babies. Then there was search and destroy, a tactic that aimed to use intelligence reports to seek out the Viet Cong. But the intelligence on which the raids were based was often found to be faulty. Helicopters would transport troops to wherever the Viet Cong were thought to be. This often meant that troops would descend on a village, but in attempting to kill Viet Cong, it was often innocent villagers that were killed, and in the process the villages were often destroyed, sometimes deliberately if they were thought to be helping the Viet Cong, for example if stashes of weapons were found. The biggest effect of the raids was to drive more peasants into supporting the Viet Cong. The most notorious of search and destroy raids took place in March 1968 in My Lai. The 100 or so soldiers that went into My Lai on the morning of Saturday, March the 16th, were known as Charlie Company. They had only been in Vietnam for 3 months, and yet had suffered over 40 casualties. Just 2 days earlier, they had a sergeant who was popular amongst the men, victim of a landmine. They were told that because it was a Saturday, any villagers that they came across would be Viet Cong or Viet Cong sympathizers. Therefore, they went into the village expecting to engage with Viet Cong, whether they be men, women or children, and they were to be killed and the village destroyed. But clearly, the families they found there were not Viet Cong. They were ordinary peasants. The killings seem to have started without warning, but thereafter there was a systematic rounding up and killing of villagers, whether they be elderly, men, women, children, or young babies. Somewhere between 350 and 500 villagers died. The soldiers' defence was that any of the villagers could have been booby-trapped. America would not only lose the support of the Vietnamese, but it was losing support for the war back home. As always, I do thank you for listening. Don't forget there's my website, my ebooks on Amazon, and the possibility of tutorials, all there to help you too, if you're interested. But whatever, good luck with your studies. Cheers.